There's something airlines don't tell you. Behind the advertising campaigns, the mileage programs, the flight attendants' smiles, there's a silent war. A billion-dollar bet that can make a company dominate the market or disappear overnight. It's about which manufacturer you choose. For decades, the game was simple. You split your orders, Boeing for some routes, Airbus for others. Protection, flexibility, insurance against disasters. Until Virgin Atlantic looked at that playbook and tore it up. Between 2019 and 2024, they did something analysts considered the worst corporate strategy. They bet almost everything on a single manufacturer. They cut ties with Boeing and accelerated deliveries with the competition. And the timing couldn't have been worse, because the manufacturer they bet on was entering a crisis. Delays, technical problems, supply chain chaos. The question isn't why they did it, it's how are they still surviving? In the world of long-haul jets, there are basically two companies, Boeing and Airbus. That's it. It's a dominant duopoly. And for decades, airlines played these two giants against each other, negotiating discounts, securing deliveries, creating competition. Virgin Atlantic, founded by Richard Branson in 1984, grew on exactly this model. In the 2000s, its fleet was an interesting mix: iconic Boeing 747s, Airbus A340s, some versatile A330s, pure diversity. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This diversity wasn't just about getting good prices, it was an operational hedge. If Boeing delayed a delivery, you had Airbus as backup. If one model had technical problems, you didn't paralyze the entire operation. If a manufacturer went on strike or faced a financial crisis, you weren't held hostage. Think of it as not putting all your eggs in one basket. And it worked for decades. Virgin operated transatlantic routes with a mix of equipment, kept costs under control, and navigated market turbulence with relative stability. In 2014, they operated about 40 aircraft of 4 different types. Complicated? Yes. Expensive in training and maintenance? Also. But safe. Only the world was changing. Starting in the mid-2010s, 3 pressures began squeezing airlines simultaneously. First was the fuel efficiency became a matter of survival. With oil fluctuating brutally and profit margins getting tighter, every liter counted. Then, environmental pressures exploded. The UK, Virgin's home base, began implementing increasingly severe climate regulations. Suddenly, operating less efficient jets wasn't just expensive, it was politically unsustainable. And finally, the operational complexity of multiple fleets became an expensive nightmare. Maintaining pilots certified for 4 different types of aircraft, spare parts inventories, specialized maintenance teams, the indirect costs were astronomical. And then came 2019. Virgin Atlantic reported losses. It wasn't catastrophic, but the signal was clear. The old model no longer worked. Something had to change. But here's the thing. Nobody expected the change to be so radical. In 2019, Virgin Atlantic announced something that caught the market by surprise. They weren't just going to renew the fleet, they were essentially abandoning Boeing. The plan was ambitious and simple at the same time. Retire all the 747s, progressively eliminate the 17 Boeing 787s still in operation, and build the future on top of 2 Airbus platforms, the A330neo and the A350-1000. Virgin ordered 12 Airbus A350-1000, one of the most advanced long-haul jets ever built. Simultaneously, they held firm on their A330neo orders. But why trade decades of diversification for dependence on a single supplier? Virgin's official answer had 3 pillars. Fuel cost: the A350-1000 consumes about 25% less fuel per seat than a 747's. The A330neo, approximately 14% more efficient than the previous generation. Now, here's what they didn't say publicly, but was obvious to those who understood the market. Boeing was entering crisis mode. The 737 MAX had been grounded globally after 2 fatal accidents. Confidence in the company was shaken. Delays in programs like the 777X were accumulating. And Virgin, watching this closely, must have thought, why bet on a lame horse when the other one is running? It seemed logical, but there was a problem nobody was discussing openly. Airbus was also behind schedule. In 2019-2020, Airbus faced its own production bottlenecks, delays on the A330neo, supply chain problems with the A350, and Virgin was betting its entire fleet renewal on precisely these models. And then came 2020. COVID-19 exploded, global aviation collapsed, and Virgin Atlantic, in the middle of a billion-dollar fleet transition, suddenly found itself fighting for survival. The bet had just gotten much, much riskier.
March 2020. The world shuts down. Planes stop. Virgin Atlantic, which had been executing its strategic transition to Airbus, found itself in a complicated situation. Revenue plummeted 70% for the entire year. Demand dropped to practically zero during global lockdowns. This forced cost cuts, flight suspensions, and investment reviews. And those new A350s that were supposed to be the company's salvation, they were sitting on Airbus's tarmac, accumulating financing costs without generating a cent of revenue. Ironic, and at the same time, fatal. Virgin had bet on operational efficiency, but efficiency doesn't matter when you're not operating. They had simplified the fleet to reduce costs, but still needed to pay for planes nobody was flying. And worse, unlike airlines that had old, already depreciated mixed fleets, Virgin was stuck in expensive leasing contracts for new aircraft. In May 2020, the company announced 3,000 job cuts, nearly a third of the workforce. In July, it avoided bankruptcy by a hair with a $1.2 billion rescue package, combining money from the main shareholder, Delta Airlines, private investors, and total debt refinancing. Here's what's fascinating, though. In the middle of the existential crisis, Virgin didn't back away from the Airbus strategy. They didn't try to renegotiate to bring Boeing back. They didn't stop A350 deliveries. On the contrary, they accelerated the retirement of the 747s and consolidated even further on the Airbus platform. Why? Because the crisis, ironically, validated the bet. When operations began to return in 2021-2022, it was the A350 routes that came back first. Why? Fuel economy. With demand still weak, Virgin couldn't afford to fly inefficient planes half-empty. The A350s allowed them to resume strategic routes while keeping costs controlled even with low load factors. And there's more. The pandemic destroyed the used aircraft market. Suddenly, those 747s and 787s that Virgin was retiring, practically worthless. Other airlines that had held on to old mixed fleets found themselves stuck with obsolete equipment nobody wanted to buy. Virgin, having accelerated the transition before the pandemic, was on the right side of this market adjustment. Speaking of which, let's talk about what happened next. 2023. Global aviation recovers, demand explodes, and suddenly having a modern fleet focused on specific models became a huge competitive advantage. Virgin reported record operating profit. Transatlantic routes, operated almost entirely by A350s and A330neos, showed margins the company hadn't seen in years. Fuel cost, which seemed like a theoretical advantage in 2019, became a direct line to the bottom line. But, and this but is crucial, the vulnerability remained. In 2023-2024, Airbus announced new production delays. Problems with Pratt & Whitney engines affecting A320neos spread throughout the chain. A350 component suppliers faced strikes, and Virgin held hostage. If you operate Boeing and Airbus, a delay is inconvenient. If you operate only Airbus, a delay paralyzes your growth. But to understand this, we need to understand what's happening now. Let's be direct. Virgin Atlantic is stuck in a defining dilemma. On one hand, the strategy worked. Virgin's current fleet is one of the most efficient in transatlantic aviation. They operate about 40 aircraft, but with drastically lower operational complexity than in the mixed fleet era. The numbers tell the story. Fuel consumption per seat kilometer, reduction of approximately 20 to 25% compared to the 2014 fleet. Maintenance costs, a drop of about 15% in proportional terms. Pilot flexibility, radically improved.
Crews transition between A330neo and A350 with minimal certification differences. And the image? Virgin positions itself as the most sustainable airline in the North Atlantic. Debatable, but certainly credible with that fleet. Total dependence on Airbus. Virgin plans to grow between 2025-2027, needs more A330neos, and is waiting for A350s. If Airbus delays, something recurrent, there's no plan B. They can no longer turn to Boeing and order new planes. Concentrated technical risk. In January 2024, failures in Rolls-Royce Trent XWB engines affected several A350s worldwide. Virgin had to ground planes for inspections. With a diversified fleet, this is manageable. With a fleet centered on the A350, it results in cancellations. Reduced bargaining power. With two manufacturers, there's competition for discounts, deadlines, and concessions. Being a customer of just one, the leverage disappears. Airbus knows Virgin can't simply migrate to Boeing, and this changes the balance of power. Before concluding Virgin made a mistake, consider this. Other airlines with mixed fleets also suffer. British Airways operates Boeing and Airbus and faces serious delays from both sides. American Airlines has 737 MAX, 787, A320, and A321 and still can't grow because all manufacturers are delayed. The difference is that Virgin has clarity. It knows exactly where the problem is and concentrates effort, negotiation, and relationship on a single supplier. It's the classic dilemma: efficiency versus resilience. With only two major manufacturers in the world, both with chronic delays, does it still make sense to maintain fleet diversity? Some analysts say yes, the risk of dependence is too high. Others say no, simplified fleets are more efficient, and maintaining two suppliers only duplicates costs while delaying the inevitable. Virgin chose efficiency. The question now is it working? The honest answer? We still don't know, and this says more about the state of modern aviation than about Virgin specifically. But here's the bigger picture. Virgin Atlantic's story is actually the story of commercial aviation reaching an inflection point. For decades, the model was diversification, but diversification has enormous and growing costs, perhaps unsustainable ones. The next decade will answer whether airlines can survive consolidated or if the risk of a single supplier is too great. Virgin is at the forefront of this experiment. Other airlines are following the opposite path, and there are those who also believe in fleet standardization. Virgin chose, they bet, and so far they're winning. But in aviation, so far is a dangerous phrase, because in this sector, things can change incredibly fast.